Welcome back to the second hour of Brighter Morning with Bhoe. My name is Pulwarty. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening on MCTV, Multicultural TV, and U97.5FM Hot Like Pepper Multicultural Radio. We have another guest of real significance in terms of the knowledge sector on the program in this second hour, and we will engage him. And before we go to him, I want to say that these conversations are meant to be conversations with people who have important knowledge to share that is of value to Trinidad and Tobago and the region in which we live, and can actually make a difference to our lives. It is not academic or intellectual talk for the sake of talking. I mean, the whole development process in our country depends on our ability to generate ideas, to focus on issues, to identify problems, and to solve these problems. That is what affects the quality of life and the level of economic progress. So this is why we do these conversations with these people, and this is why I think that you should value it, and it should be important to you. At least I hope that it is important to you. Is Dr. Pulwarty on the line? No. No? All right. Well, while we wait for him to connect with us, he is in Colorado in the United States, and he is a senior a senior leader, I would say, and researcher. He's published almost 100 publications in referee journals, maybe 60 or 70. Probably more than that, because those numbers come from about 3 or 4 years ago. And he is a son of the soil who is operating at a global level. And we want to engage him today on some of the issues that are important to him and important to us, and important to us as islands, as communities in the region, as tropical countries, but also important in the world system, because the world is very, very interconnected. And science tells us more and more how connected we are. So I want to welcome Dr. Roger Pulwarty to the program, Brighter Morning. Dr. Pulwarty, welcome to Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and we're glad to have you on. You are in Colorado now, is that correct?
I am. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, about 2 hours behind you.
Yes, I got you up very early today.
Yes, but that's quite all right.
Yeah, I know there's a time difference, and it makes it very early in Boulder. But we're glad to have you. And you are a senior scientist at NOAA. So for the benefit of allowing our viewers and listeners to know, explain very succinctly what NOAA is and what it does.
Sure. Great. But thank you very much. Always take a wonderful opportunity to interact with home, and a place always dear to my heart. So the NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It is part of the Department of Commerce in the United States. It is the scientific arm for weather, climate, and ocean research and applications for the U.S. government. But as a result, a lot of the work that's being done, as we like to say, goes from measuring solar flares, on how those affect satellites and communication, all the way down to the seabed of the ocean floor. So in between those two very big dimensions are the National Weather Service, which is part of NOAA. We use the National Hurricane Center models and the forecast, as everybody in our region knows. And in addition to that, also issues such as mapping marine litter, like plastics and so on, the migration and movement of fish species and marine mammals, basically the measurements and archiving of climate data for much of the world. And it is really the interactive international arm of scientific contributions to things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others. So NOAA covers, from looking at the sun to looking at the seabed, and all of the research applications and so on that go into trying to help sustain our economies and our environment. And so that, in a nutshell, is what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is. And as I mentioned, it is in the Department of Commerce for a reason that a lot of the scientific information is closely tied to basically our economic or social or environmental capital.
Or well-being, yes. So everything from the seabed to the space, outer space around us, and the forces of nature interacting with each other, and their implications for humanity and society and the geography of the earth on which we live. Right? Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's putting it quite well. Yeah.
So I want to now give people a sense of who you are, and I want to play a little clip here in which you basically present yourself. So I will do that now.
Hi, my name is Roger Pulwarty. I'm the Senior Scientist, or the ST, in the NOAA Physical Sciences Laboratory. The ST, or the Scientific or Technical Professional, is a unique role within the NOAA and within the federal government. The roles are to conduct research and development that helps meet the mission, but it does not involve any management responsibilities. I work closely with the Physical Sciences Director to provide strategic advice and overall scientific leadership to the Physical Sciences Lab. My own research and publications focus on weather, water, and climate extremes, disaster risk management, and resilience in the US, Latin America, and Caribbean. I have a background in tropical meteorology and climate, and also an academic and research background in impacts assessments, disaster risk reduction, and decision-making. In previous roles, I helped design, develop, and lead applied interdisciplinary research services and services programs, including the U.S. National Integrated Drought Information System, the NOAA Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, and others. I've been a lead and convening lead author on national and international assessments and NOAA agreements, including the IPCC Working Group 2, the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction Global Assessment Reports, and the European and US National Climate Assessments. I've served on various WMO committees as well, including the Global Climate Observing System and the Global Framework on Climate Services, and have provided testimonies for the US Congress on behalf of NOAA. With the Physical Sciences Director, we together work to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the US R&D enterprise and its value to the nation and to the NOAA partners by predicting our path through a varying and changing climate. So we create a culture of partnerships, which you will hear more about. We design and conduct research that supports the mission objectives. And most critically, in my role, I help to realize the role and value of science in decision-making across NOAA line offices and with our partners. I act as a subject matter expert to our partners, and I ensure that the physical sciences and NOAA research is at the table. Most critically, the director and I working together help foster physical sciences innovations in support of new NOAA initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Roger. It gives a picture of the tremendous work that you do, not only in the United States, but worldwide. And you collaborate everywhere in the world on very, very important issues, including risk management. And you also work in the Caribbean. I will get into that in a minute. But what would you say is the most important challenge that the world is facing now, in which you as a scientist in NOAA are involved in collaboration with others?
So thanks for the question, Dr. Tewari. As a good Trini, I'm nothing if not adaptable. And so the essence of adaptability is the ability to learn. And from that standpoint, as we think through some of the challenges we're facing, we hear a lot about the changing nature of extremes. You're seeing the floods, the droughts, things like that. We can mention some of those in a little bit, the wildfires in the western United States. We were just mentioning the issues in Germany, China, and in our own region. So for me, the challenge is not that things are changing, but it is the rate and direction of which they're changing that is a major challenge. Because as we know, it's not simply our ability to adapt, which we've been good at over time, but it is how quickly we can adjust to a rapidly changing environment. And that requires learning, it requires our institutions, and it requires the full use of the capabilities and the minds of all of society, which means in addition to knowing the risk, we have to know how to act on it. And our major issues that we're seeing is that many events are occurring at the same time, what we call compounding and cascading risks. But the major challenge is how our institutions and our partnerships learn to incorporate that information into its planning for financial services, for water security, for food security, and for the well-being of communities themselves. And in the latter case, the challenge is giving people the ability to make the changes in their lives that they want to make. And that's the essence of human being, is to make our own choices.
Those big issues that you are talking about all over the world, we saw the flooding in China. People were almost up to their shoulders in water. We saw the flooding in Germany. I can't remember if it was 174, but certainly a large number of people who died. We had it in Belgium. We have the forest fires in the United States. We have it in Canada. And the scientific evidence that these things are climate change related is very, very clear, isn't it?
So the evidence, the data, the models, the changes in the data that we're seeing over the last, at least since the 1960s, certainly longer than that for the long-term records. It's not anyone who looks at the data actually across the world, in which we actually take into account over 15,000 types of observations. It's very clear. It is changing, and it is changing at a rapid rate. And that shouldn't be in question in the sense of how things have been changing, because the scientific and the observational basis are actually clear. Now, we have to look at those things very carefully in the sense that this is global change. This is climate change of the Earth. It's not climate change in my backyard. So when I say, ooh, I have a station in my backyard and it's going the other way, that's not surprising. It's whether or not the entire region, area, country, and so on is actually showing that signal. So it's unequivocal. The changes are happening. It's a combination of human-caused drivers and natural variability. And when we add those together, we get surprises in the system of the kind that you just mentioned. The big floods in Germany, the slow-moving storms that actually, which was called the Bernd by the German meteorologists. I was just talking to the Deutsche Wetterdienst yesterday, which is the German Met Service, about what was driving these factors, the issues in China, and certainly the heat wave in the US and the die-off of marine mammals and the nearshore environment and marine animals in Canada, very much tied to increasing hotter temperatures that is driving a more extreme atmosphere. And that's unequivocal. There's no there's no scientist worth his or her salt that would not say that is the case.
Okay, now what about the Caribbean? I know you work with the Caribbean and you work with collaborators here in the region. Tell me about, first of all, some of the work that you are doing here in collaboration with others, things that you are focused on, and what are some of the challenges that we need to pay attention to and worry about and build capacity for?
So as we, thanks for the question, and as we saw, in terms of the impacts of recent events in our region, we went from probably the worst drought from 2013 to 2016 in the region into one of the worst hurricane seasons on record on 2017, which had the strongest indicator of hurricane strength, which we call the cyclone energy, which is, how strong the winds are. 2017 was the strongest year. 2020 was the second strongest. And as everyone who's interested in the climate change question knows, since 2014, we've seen about 7 of the warmest years on record. But it's not just saying, wow, it's 1 degree C warmer, you need one less layer of clothing. That drives the systems that we see in our region. The hurricanes, the droughts, the floods. We have excellent regional institutions with whom we work, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, a network of partners with whom they work throughout the region. The Caribbean Public Health Administration, you had James Hospitalis on, I think, earlier, an exemplar of the types of partnerships, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Authority. Certainly others like that, like Canary and Carilac, the electrical grid folks, and so on. The risk to our region is multiple. We face multiple stresses, not one risk at a time. During last year, one of the issues we had to deal with in the Gulf of Mexico region was basically the ability to shelter people from hurricane risk while still dealing with COVID and PPE issues. Throughout our region, we're seeing a rapidly changing environment in the oceans as well as the atmosphere, and our planning, and this isn't only symbolic of the Caribbean, but our planning has not actively incorporated those changes into long-term sustainable strategies. That is globally. I actually think the work that has been done through these partners that I just mentioned is actually a landmark. I chair something called the Climate Services Information System for the World Meteorological Organization that helps countries develop their capabilities. We have one of the best in the world in the region, run by CIMH and coordinated through the Caribbean Community Climate Center in Belize. So I do think we have the capabilities. The necessary issue is really how we take those changing extremes into account. We're no longer simply saying, wow, 2100, how do we respond to that? Well, that's great. That's like saying we know something about the future. The idea is how we manage through uncertainty, which is the present through the next decades. And I think we have the institutions to help us do it. And I can say a bit more about how we work with them and with others through the region. And then the types of capacity and capabilities that we have, drawing on the rich educational tradition of people in our region.
Okay, we have the problem of hurricanes and the disasters that they create when it happens. So that is one issue. We have the problem of sea level rise in this part of the world, and that is going to create other problems as well. What are we doing in some of these areas and in the area of disaster preparedness, etc., which are inevitable for places like the Caribbean, given the pace of change with the climate worldwide?
So this is an excellent question because it begs the problem that we're facing with globally and definitely in our region, that our traditional approaches to risk management, one flood at a time, one hurricane at a time, one drought, is not the nature of the way in which climate changes. All of those things change at the same time. The Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Authority, working closely with NOAA and a whole host of people, the CIMH and others in the region, focus on community resilience, on social protection, on capacity building. But as I mentioned, what the challenge is that our traditional approaches are being overwhelmed by the complexity of these types of efforts. Not just complex, like the drought I was mentioning, 2013 to 2016, was not simply unfamiliar, it was unprecedented. A different kind of impact. So there are a set of activities that are occurring in trying to get our heads around this. The regional platform for the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, is having its regional meeting for Latin America and the Caribbean later this year, in which we're trying to pull together those various ideas. I lead an effort there for the global assessment of such risk. Our capabilities on sea level rise has to be grounded, and is being grounded, but at a small scale, on what we call nature-based solutions, not simply hard and fast built infrastructure, but more resilient infrastructure. And there's a lot of efforts going on in that context. As we think through that, there's also issues of ensuring that equity, gender issues, people who are marginalized are engaged in the process. This is a bigger challenge than we used to have, or used to really acknowledge was the case decades ago, when we just basically built or did whatever we sort of wanted to do. We know for sure that nature-based solutions actually have not just high economic benefit, but they're more resilient to a changing and uncertain environment. In other words, we do not need to predict it precisely in order for us to respond. When I work with Native Americans in the Four Corners region, as one person told me, he says, you know, a tribal elder, he said, uncertainty is not just what you do not know, it's what you know that is no longer so. This is an important lesson. The things that we have come to learn and plan around are no longer the guides, but yet the future is uncertain. Just acknowledging that we do not know means that learning is needed. So as we think about storm surge, I was actually just talking to the head of the office, the tsunami office in Puerto Rico yesterday. The complexity of changes that we're seeing requires the coordination among our institutions. We always ask for this, but it is even more so, more immediate. As people know, when Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit Puerto Rico, yes, there was building damage, but the bigger problem was the resilience of the infrastructure. The network for water, health, Wi-Fi, all of that fell apart. It took more than 3 months to even get back basic services. We live in an interconnected and global world. Things that happen globally drive local imbalances. And our institutions that are helping to do this, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, which works closely with us, actually developed the early warning information systems that helped us protect lives. It's traceable. We know that it helped in 2017 and again last year. So there are efforts going on how we are warned to get out of the way of disasters. And there are also longer-term efforts that are being conducted by CARFA, by SEDIMA and others on social protection and community resilience. The issue, as in other regions, is these are not yet up to the scale to make us a completely resilient society, whether it's in Trinidad or throughout the region. But the work that they're doing doesn't need to be reinvented. It just needs to be built upon. When people ask me, in terms of all of these things we've engaged in, I always tell, well, if you've done a million things, then the world should be a better place, right? I always make that point to folks. Well, we are better off in the Caribbean than we were 20 or 30 years ago. There's no question about that. One of the things I'm most proud of in your question is this effort we built at UE at Cave Hill, a master's program coordinated by Leonard Nurse, now retired from UE, Neville Trotz, Ken Leslie, just retired from the 5 Cs. We coordinated and developed a cadre of professionals throughout the region, over 100 of them who are there now, who now, when we have the regional outlook for, in which people come together to say, what are the conditions, how are they changing? They're the ones that bring the data, the information, the networks, and most importantly, the voice of people who are usually not in that sort of process. The Regional Outlook Forum, which is coordinated by CIMH, is actually strongly built around a network of these professionals who are throughout our region. And they've turned out to be one of the best efforts of capacity building that we've seen in the world for strengthening the use of climate information and how we plan. So that type of capacity is way beyond did we write a new paper or a new report. That is how we get knowledge into practice.
Yes. And the knowledge you want is really to create the capacity for continuing to learn and continuing to learn in order to continue to adapt. And it's also the capacity to take action that is preventative and mitigating. Is that correct?
Absolutely. There's an old saying, never confuse activity with action. This is
Yes.
definitely geared towards acting on the best available knowledge,
Yeah.
but doing the right thing that
Act,
has the
act,
dimensions of environment, economy, and equity.
yeah, I have always said activity burns up your time, but action yields results. And that is the big distinction. That is the difference. Now, we are living in a world in which the rate of change is faster, it seems, than our ability to adapt. Now, the human species has always been able to survive in the entire evolutionary process by being able to adapt, to deal with, to cope with change. But we are having a situation now where the rate of change is faster than human beings can adapt. But more significantly, the institutions that we have created for the solutions to our problems are not, what can I say, quick enough to adapt to keep pace with that change. So how do we deal with this challenge, which is a challenge everywhere, no matter how advanced we are, in terms of addressing the challenges of climate change and its impact?
So this is a key point. The essence of adaptation is learning and learning when to revise our assumptions about planning, what we think we know. Let's take a look at two of the events you just mentioned earlier. The flooding in Germany, actually most of the mortality occurred in rural areas that were built, that had houses that were built centuries ago around a particular kind of wooden structure called the Fachwerk that actually was vulnerable to flooding, but they had not experienced this issue of having 2 days of rainfall, similar to what we had in 1999 was the classic thing in Venezuela. I had worked on that issue in a month's rainfall in a matter of 2 days. The rural areas got damaged by this. In China, you saw the flooding in the subways and so on. Actually, a city, an urban area, a well-developed one in Henan and in Zhangzhou, actually were impacted in ways that we would not have expected. We wouldn't have expected Germany to have rural issues and China to have the urban issues. Yet those are the things that actually happened. So as we begin to think through the changing nature of the risks and now of our built system and the way we manage risks, it's imperative that, of course, that how we learn, who does the learning, and how we finance new plans and structures become important. As we like to say, half of the buildings that we will see in 2050 have not yet been built. As we think through these issues, one of the major things that we can think about is who is to do it? Where are the people? Not just what the structural risk is, which we have a lot of, ad nauseum IPCC reports, global assessment reports that tells us what that risk is. We have a lot of recommendations on what we ought to do, but not enough on how that training, the link between the public and the private sector and NGOs and the universities produces a new cadre of professionals who help us work on that interface. As we all know, Trinidad is one of the most, from a standpoint of potential and people, the small village I'm from in Central, I had some of the most capable people who didn't have the wherewithal and the opportunities that I was lucky to have. This is what we need to create because those minds are the ones we need. Now, beyond those kinds of generalities is who supports it. As we think about that, the way we deal with global risks, as I mentioned, when there's a drought in the US West or in Brazil or in one of the food baskets of the world, as we saw in 2009, 2010, that can create food insecurity for us. When we think about those global risks, water, we need people who keep the whole system in mind and actually can pay attention to where the nodes of failure might be. And I'll give you, for instance, when we saw the solar winds issues and so on with our cyber, small changes can produce cascading risks over time. This is a changing nature of risk, not just if that happened, what we would do. How do we stop future surprises from impacting us negatively? Can't stop all of them.
Okay.
But what we actually need, and this is what I think you see with certain individuals in the institutions I mentioned, from SEDIMA to CIMH to certainly Red Cross in our region, to different individuals. We see some of those individuals in those settings, but not the partnerships that are needed with the educational system in producing a new type of professional that can deal with complexity. That sort of issue is a gap in the world, but I actually think in our region we have the basis and the enabling capabilities already existing with a good high school system, with excellent universities that can help serve the public more strongly than we've been doing.
And you said we have over 100 people who have been trained by NOAA with collaboration with regional institutions and the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill, who are playing an important role in this system of building resilience and capacity and knowledge. Is that correct?
So let me be clear. The university has trained them. We have helped train them. So I take the full capability, and the benefit goes to UE in Cave Hill. We've also helped develop one of the, surprisingly, one of the best and strongest centers for understanding climate risks in the region, which is at Mona, led by Tanisha Stevenson and Michael Taylor and others. So we've played a role on helping people develop their own capabilities, as opposed to give me your data, I'll hand it back to you. As my brother used to say, that's like borrowing your watch to tell you the time. And so the idea here is how people's own capabilities are created, but to do what? And that's where the guidance, the observations, the use of engagement strategies for small communities are what we actually teach in those, have been taught in those courses. Support for them has been gotten through the State Department, through the Caribbean Development Bank, through the EU, through other partners, certainly by CARICOM governments. So it's been a sort of an innovative approach to how we develop our people in the region. And that is one of the, to me, one of the most positive and forward-looking things that we've done throughout the globe, and it happens in our region.
Okay, so that's knowledge transfer and building capacity. Now, when you talked about growing up in central Trinidad and you talked about home, I got
my wife would say I haven't grown up yet, Dr. Tirawi. So, to put that in context.
I thought you became a little emotional when you talked about that, maybe the memory or something. Am I correct, or am I seeing something else?
Oh, no, it's actually strongly emotional. And I go home very regularly. I'm in the region. I mean, one of the things I decided a long time ago, even as a student at Presentation Chaguanas, was if I were to do something, it would have to impact where I live.
Okay, so the work that you are doing, I mean, you are working worldwide and you are involved in all of these issues. But, I mean, your real desire and your act of love would really be to do as much as you can for Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And all of the things that we mentioned, that others are engaged in too, the UN efforts, things with the World Bank, with our own regional folks. We know of the disconnect between, places like the United States and the UK and Europe with our region. And part of my goal was to make that disconnect more permeable, as opposed to saying, wow, I've got a project going on in some part of the region of the Caribbean. No, the idea was, how do we create the enabling capabilities so that our people could do it? And that was actually the thing behind Leonard Nurse at UE, Cave Hill, myself, and others saying, we need to basically bring that capacity. But for that capacity to be meaningful, we're dealing with hurricanes, right? There's no question that the intensity, not the frequency in our basin, but the intensity of those storms are changing. We know we're being overwhelmed by these complex cascading risks when, going from a bad drought to a bad hurricane season. And so that scientific understanding, just last year, we coordinated a full field program, not just one more study saying we're at risk, but a full field program in the Eastern Tropical Atlantic with CIMH, with the university and others, on how is convection changing in the tropical Atlantic. This was a full field program with the Europeans on airplanes. We got students involved. So it goes from the actual measurement of how the system is changing to the capacity for people to engage with communities on how they're responding.
Yes.
And for me, that was what I was really after in trying to think through these situations. I saw firsthand, from the village I was growing up in, how, to me, listening to birds around my house, around where we live, is a central part of being Trinidadian. I grew up with that sound. And so I'm grounded, actually, in the place where I'm from, regardless of where I end up.
Yeah. Now, you told me a little story about your father's story about what makes a carpenter. And I think it's a very instructive story for the relationship between learning, capacity building, and competence. Could you tell that story and then extrapolate from that?
Sure. So we're in a world where we're good at tool building. Ever since everybody's seen the opening scenes of 2001, right? Where the idea of tools are all critical. And my dad said, look, you have a nail, you have a saw, and you have a hammer, and you have some board, you're still not a carpenter, right? And if anybody has ever seen me do anything, try to build a bench, I'm not a carpenter. But the key point of that lesson is we can learn the tools from statistics to modeling, to studying how human beings act, their perception, their response. But until that has an impact on the bridge between what we know, how we act, and how it helps us create a more resilient society, then we're not in the role of a knowledge broker. We're as I like to call them, we just have lessons drawn, not lessons learned. To make them lessons learned, you have to be a carpenter. You have to be embedded and engaged in the communities. And that's exactly, again, as I mentioned, the UE effort that we had was to create such carpenters, not people simply who were technicians, who learned to use everything from GIS to modeling, but also knew what it meant in the context of people's lives. That's the thing that makes it valuable. Now, that might sound, arm wavy and so on to some people, but the idea, though, is we've also built several other programs to make that happen and to be sustained in the long term. One effort that I helped develop in the US, and we're using the model in different parts of the world, is the Integrated Science and Assessments Program. This is social, physical, decision-making folks from public and private sector working together to answer questions driven by what communities need. That's how we craft new professionals, new carpenters.
Okay, great. I raised this question with James Hospitalis when I spoke with him, and he gave me an answer from the health point of view. But how has COVID impacted on all of these things that you are involved in, and their impact on human beings wherever they live? Is there a connection between these that we are seeing now, and does it alert us to things that we might have to do?
So this question has become a fundamental question within the UN processes, from everything to the Sustainable Development Goals to the Disaster Risk Reduction Agreements of Sendai, which is led by the UN Office of DRR, Disaster Risk Reduction, to climate change, the UNFCCC, the Framework on Climate Convention.
Let me understand this clearly. You mean COVID and the experience of COVID as an informing principle?
So what that has done, the issue of COVID-19, and we just released a report with the Economic Commission of Latin America and with the regional office of the UNDR, is to show that when we have surprises in the system, when we have what we call systemic risk, this is a new sort of word and concept, but COVID-19 is has created what we call a systemic risk, something that happens globally, influences locally, leads to different decisions, the contagion of risks that we saw during things like the economic crisis in the late 2000s. In that report, we show pretty clearly that trying to respond to COVID-19 has actually undermined many of the efforts we have in disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. And in fact, a lot of the support that goes into responding to COVID were not put in, and this is globally, back into adaptive strategies. We call it the adaptation gap. COVID, not climate related, yet introduces an additional layer and level on our capacity and capabilities to interact. From the moment we had that first case diagnosed in March of 2020 to now, we've seen a decline in remittances because of impacts in different parts of the world, and we know how much our region depends on that. We've seen, of course, the most visible things, tourism, the loss, the weakening of some of our trade networks, but definitely the value chain issues. Those introduce new complexities into how we think about risk. So it's not simply one of being proactive, it's one of being what we call prospective, i.e., how do we not let new catastrophic risks emerge? COVID-19 is an abject lesson in exactly this. What is the overlay of these globally driven risks, the networks, our transportation system, our communication systems, that actually introduce new risks and vulnerabilities into how we respond to disaster risks and climate change. We might not think they're related, but certainly issues like COVID and the broader network of issues like that have actually, I would say, reduced our capabilities. Now, we've shown in that study that I mentioned that it takes about, depending on when we get critical levels of vaccines, that economies and so on, will take 3 to 6 years to recover in some cases. Now, if you add that on top of what I was mentioning about Puerto Rico, in which Irma and Maria basically set back the island about 20 years in its economic development, and that's some studies out of that came out of some economic groups at MIT. We can no longer say that these things are not connected. In other words, managing COVID-19, sheltering, PPE is somehow independent of this other risk called climate change. So we've moved out of simply thinking climate is an environmental issue into how it affects our business analytics, how it affects our environment, and how it affects our own capabilities to respond. So the COVID-19 idea, not to sort of exoticize it, has become a major organizing principle around which we look at global risks and how they affect other things in the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, so we are now at the juncture then when we are looking at a multiple risks environment. You're
Absolutely.
looking at an inter-impactive risk environment, and basically you're looking at the escalation of these things and what can happen. And more than that, how do you anticipate and prevent them or prepare for them or whatever? Is that correct? Is that where we're going?
That's correct. The thing about anticipation is, the old saying, right? If you want to make God laugh, you tell him your plans about the future. And so the idea here in anticipation, or you tell her your plans, but the idea here is really one of, we understand our history. We're not fully aware of all the things and why we are where we are, the things we've built, fact or cities and towns are where they are on our islands. There are the different stresses that are driven globally. There's the tipping points from major hurricane seasons and certainly the loss of biodiversity in our region. How all of those add up to create these potential tipping points and multiple stresses are not completely predictable.
Yeah.
So I want to say anticipation includes the potential to learn and respond to surprises.
Yes.
A surprise by definition is not predictable.
Right.
So in addition to the things we might be able to predict, the changes in temperature, the potential changes in strengths of hurricanes and droughts, as one of the things we're saying is, heat waves, droughts, and so on are not necessarily caused by climate change, but they are exacerbated by it. When you get into a drought, we've shown because of the temperature background and increase, it's harder to get out of one. So those are things we can anticipate the spread of and learn how to adapt. But this is where things like art, literature, storytelling comes to bear. in how we think about future risks. As the old saying goes, human beings, the world is made up of physical particles, but human beings are made up of stories. That notion of anticipation is the stories we tell about the future that we want, without simply saying, wow, if this happens, we will do that. Well, that's actually claiming more certainty about the world than we have. We do know the direction that's changing. The reliability of temperature and the projections of temperature are pretty accurate, and is grounded in actually multiple decades of good science. How it changes and the extent of those surprises are why our institutions are the key part of this, and how we work across those. It's bigger than any one institution, it's bigger than any one country. And so we have to sort of get over our insularity. And that's not just us in our region, that's around the world.
Global cooperation
we're all in this together.
has become a necessity. Yeah. Global cooperation has
Yes.
become a necessity. But as we come to a close now, I want you to, if you can very quickly talk about what does all of this mean to people in the Caribbean for food, water, and quality of life. What should we be concerned about with regard to that?
So the issues that you raise are central, right? The notion that the Caribbean is actually one of the most reliable. We don't think of this during the rainy season, but it is in the projections one of the most reliably drying places in the world. The Caribbean's actually pretty dry, especially in the southern. There are about 6 different regional components of the Caribbean in terms of climate, when rain happens and how during the season. But the signal is a drying one throughout our region. And we estimate that places like Jamaica during the tourism season uses about 10 times the amount of rainfall it's actually getting. They use up the groundwater and things like that. That's a necessity. The issue of water is critical. The idea, as we saw in COVID-19, the idea that trade and supply chains were actually developed for a stable global economy that gets disrupted when you have things like COVID, disrupts and changes the prices of the food we import. So there's a food security question that we know, the water security question. Financing behind how we act has to be shown to be not just avoiding the losses from these disasters, but offering the opportunity to thrive and actually, make the goods and services that we provide more viable in the region. Now, what I mean by that is that we actually do have a lot of financing coming into the region. The alignment behind adaptation needs to be a little bit clearer. On the ground, as I mentioned, there's water, there's food, there's disaster risk reduction. But probably the most important thing for people in our region is seeing themselves able to make the changes in their local environment that they need to make. Whether it's, making sure we have protected green areas, we are cleaning our drains, we're doing the simple things in our lives. One of the most important things that we saw in Barbados was the development of community solar, actually, for hot water heating, which is one of the big efforts. More than half of the households in Barbados actually have that. We've helped develop desal plants for places like Bhoe and others. But in our region, the local capabilities are actually, we somehow think that somebody else fixes it, but in fact, it's about us. So the awareness that we can make those changes ourselves are actually what's needed, and the wherewithal to do that through the different types of financing. So water, energy, the region imports about 95% of its energy supply. Migration issues that are now more and more central. At the same time that we see throughout the region, at the same time we saw the political upheaval in places like Venezuela, they were also going through a serious drought at the time that affected local food security. Those types of questions are critical, but they all center around our ability and our capabilities to respond to change. And that's where the institutions, the financing, and really the new types of professionals I was talking about comes to bear.
Well, Roger, I want to thank you so much for taking the time in this early morning hour in Boulder, Colorado, to talk with us this morning and to give so much information and insight into what is happening with climate change and its impact and its relationship with COVID and its impact on the lives of ordinary people in the Caribbean with very, very good examples, and the tremendous work that you are doing, not only all over the world, but you are impacting here in the region, in Barbados, in Jamaica, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Belize, etc. And we want to thank you for that. I know that you have been honored in Trinidad and Tobago. I know NEHUS gave you an Icon Award a little while ago.
Very much appreciated.
Yes, I think you are somebody that the region and Trinidad and Tobago, certainly as a son of the soil, should find a way of honoring more for the tremendous work that you do and the tremendous global knowledge that you bring to the Caribbean challenges that we face and the possibility of solutions and capacity building here in the region. So I want to thank you very much for joining me this morning, for having such an important conversation about an important issue in the world and in the region. And I hope that you'll come back on another occasion where we can have a further discussion. Thank you so much.
Would be honored to. Thank you.
All right, then. Well, thank you very much, listeners, viewers, citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. You have been listening to Dr. Raja Pulwarty, who is the senior scientist at NOAA in the United States, involved in global work, but very, very supportive of regional institutions throughout the Caribbean and regional people throughout the Caribbean and in the solution of Trinidad and Tobago and Caribbean problems. We're very happy to have had the conversation with him. Earlier, we had a conversation with the principal of the University of the West Indies, Professor Brian Copeland. And tomorrow, we're going to have some important guests for you. We want you to join them so that we can have more knowledge, more information, important conversation. And we thank you for listening. We thank you for viewing. This is Brighter Morning with Bhoe, and my name is Bhoe Tiwari. Thank you very much. We pass on to Shanil Alsuran for the news.